If you're looking for clear pro-life thinking, cutting-edge apologetics, and a fresh approach to abortion dialogue, you've come to the right place. This is the Equipped for Life podcast.
All right, well, I am excited to invite into the podcast Jordan Warfel, who has a very, very interesting topic for this. This is going to be one of the most interesting topics I've had on our queue for a while. I will get into that in a minute, but just real quick, let me introduce Jordan. Jordan Warfel is from Sussex, Delaware, a residential draftsman and the father of three. After graduation, Jordan went to Rosedale Bible College, a school affiliated with his church. It was at Rosedale that he earned an associate's in biblical studies degree. He also met Felicia, is that the right way to pronounce her name? Okay, I just want to make sure I get that right, whom he would later marry. Jordan returned to Sussex County to earn a bachelor's in organizational management degree from Wilmington University. And I had to clarify, this is Wilmington in Delaware, not the Wilmington in North Carolina that I have done some stuff at. Today, he is self-employed with his father, John Warfel, as a residential draftsman, which means that you design blueprints, right? Like you draw the blueprints in the computer, you design houses.
Yeah.
That is super cool. Together, Jordan and John design houses being built all over Sussex County. As a foster parent, Jordan saw firsthand the many challenges children in foster care face. They have three children, ages 2, 3, and 5, the oldest of whom is adopted. Jordan uses his experience to advocate for foster care and adoption, and he authored a pro-life book that details his experiences. Jordan is also a founding member of Living Hope Fellowship, where he has volunteered in a variety of positions. Jordan, welcome to the Equipped for Life podcast.
Thank you. It's really great to be with you. I've been enjoying your podcast for quite a long time, and it's really a pleasure to actually be on as a guest with you today.
Well, thank you. You brought a great topic. Like as soon as you brought this up, it's like, oh man, we have to talk about this. So you sent me a Facebook message about a pro-choice conspiracy theory, and you're like, this is legit. And when I first read your summary description of this conspiracy theory, in my mind, I'm like, either this can't be real, or if it is real, only 5 people believe this or something like that, right? But you sent me here's a video that NARAL, the NARAL has put out, and you said and you had seen a speech on it, and that there was a book. So I watched the video, and I was like, wow, this is pretty nuts. And I basically said, okay, I want us to talk about this. I am not going to do any research on this. I've never been less prepared for a podcast because I want to experience this with the listeners. It is a nutso theory. But what I asked you to do in prep is to read the book, because we want to, as we always try to do on this podcast, steel man versus straw man, as Sam Harris says. And so it's look, maybe the video is just showing kind of a lame version of this argument. And if the book has the more academic or interesting or something version, I want us to be able to talk about that too. And so, Jordan, you have read the book now.
Yes.
And you are ready to tell us everything you know about this conspiracy theory so we can talk about it. Sure. I appreciate you taking that time to read this book. I am so interested in hearing about this, but why don't you go ahead and catch everyone up? Why don't just kind of introduce what the basic conspiracy theory is?
Sure. So I saw it all started with an ad on Facebook for a NARAL virtual conference. And I'm
Facebook really has your number if you're getting that ad.
Apparently NARAL put anyone interested in abortion, but didn't specify pro-choice.
That's interesting.
So there were lots of pro-life people commenting underneath their ad, I can't wait to see what the other side has to say. And
that's a rookie mistake.
I registered. It was free, no cost. They had some really big names, Senator Warren, Senator Booker. I'm all right, this is going to be great opposition research. I'm going to get into these people's heads.
I love it.
So I attended about half of the conference. Interestingly,
is it a virtual conference or are you there somewhere? Okay.
It's a virtual conference on the internet.
Got it.
And of course, it went over Sunday morning, so I missed that for church. I'm not skipping church for the NARAL conference. But that's where I heard Ilyse Hogue, who's the president of NARAL, give her keynote speech. And her keynote speech was all about her book and this view of the world that she has, this kind of conspiratorial view of the world, where basically the pro-life movement is almost entirely evangelicals who are motivated by a desire to bring back racial segregation. So that is
our primary directive. That's our primary drive. Okay.
Yeah, that's the, like, these people don't really care if women are having abortions. That's not really what they're concerned about. This is just like a way to win elections so that they can get judges to overturn Brown v. Board of Education, apparently.
Wow.
It sounds really wild-eyed and like, why would somebody do this? But when I read the book, I came out convinced she absolutely believes everything she put in the book.
So what you're saying, this isn't like she's trying to get attention with kind of a really radical kind of extremist view. She buys it.
I think she 100% buys it. I think she absolutely buys it. And I actually have what I believe is sort of her motivation. I was going to read it from the book.
Yeah, please
so you all can kind of see, because she's the one who puts this as like the centerpiece of her book, not me. This is from her.
Yeah.
She says, quote, "At the center of this narrative is an inarguable fact. The overwhelming majority of Americans support and have always supported a woman's right to end her pregnancy." And she goes on throughout her book to cite over and over again, and they did this in the NARAL conference too, drilling into our heads that 7 in 10 Americans agree with NARAL. 7 in 10 Americans agree with the NARAL. So there's no nuance to it at all. And so when I looked, like, she cites sources for these statistics, right? And when I went to look at the sources, it would be things like an NPR article about a poll. And the headline of the article would say, "Most Americans support legal access to abortion and restrictions on abortion."
Okay.
And I'm thinking to myself, but Ilyse Hogue doesn't support restrictions on abortion. And she cited that as her source. But they're very emotionally invested in the belief that their side is the overwhelming majority. Like, this just dominated everything to do with the conference. We are the majority. And what I studied a little bit into conspiracy theories and why people are motivated to believe them. One of the things that can motivate people is if you're part of an ideological group. She's part of an ideological group, as am I, right? I'm pro-life. I'm very involved. One of the indicators of somebody who's likely to believe in conspiracy theories is that the other party holds the White House, which it does for her.
Interesting.
Another belief is the belief in the superiority of your group, that my group is better than other groups.
Yeah.
Can lead people to believe in conspiracy theories.
And in this case, you, real quick, flesh out better in that situation? Does that mean more morally virtuous? Is that smarter? Is that like all of the above?
It can be any of those.
Okay.
It's just that somehow my group is better than yours. It can be morally better. In this case, I think for Ilyse Hogue, we're in the majority, and so we're right.
Wow. Okay. And so as deep as it goes?
That's sort of like the driving thing. Like we don't even have to take the other side terribly seriously, because it's not about the arguments. It's not even about abortion. It's about political power. And we have 70%, and there's no reason Donald Trump should have won this election. So now she's got a problem. If 70% of Americans are believing the same thing she does about abortion, how does somebody like Trump get elected? You have to explain that somehow. And so a lot of this book is really just her attempt to kind of explain how she believes evangelicals have taken abortion and used it to win elections, when in reality, we don't really even believe it ourselves. It's
wow. There's a lot there.
Yeah, there's like stepping stones on the way to this conspiracy theory. She didn't just drag it out of midair.
Yeah.
So you'll find in the first chapter, she borrows a smaller, like a little bit more plausible conspiracy theory from an intellectual. His name is, let me grab my cheat sheet here because I'm terrible with names.
Yeah, that's all right.
His name is Randall Balmer.
Okay.
And Randall Balmer is an evangelical progressive historian.
Okay.
And he came up with his own little conspiracy theory. And in his conspiracy theory, there's a conservative activist named Paul Weyrich, who was one of the men who helped start the Heritage Foundation, a bunch of different conservative causes, and that he conspired with Jerry Falwell to convince evangelicals to care about abortion so that they could use it as a way to beat Jimmy Carter. That is Ballmer's conspiracy theory. Okay. His isn't quite as wild-eyed, and he's got some reasons for it. In his conspiracy, the only people actually conspiring are Jerry Falwell, Paul Weyrich, and their close associates. So it's not like thousands of people are involved in this.
And this would have been happening. So this would be
in the 1970s, a few years after Roe v. Wade.
Like, I don't know. It's like, yeah, there's a part of that. Like, I don't know if that would be super surprising to me, because in the 70s, most of the church didn't seem to care about abortion.
Correct.
Right. And so
he is a historian. So he's got a lot of historical evidence to sort of back up his conspiracy theory. So his is sort of plausible. There's a number of problems with it. His entire conspiracy hinges on a conversation that he had with Paul Weyrich in the year 1990. And we don't have any documentation of this conversation. Nobody was like witnessing it to say, yeah, that's what he said, or you interpreted it correctly. But basically, he says that he went to an evangelical conference in 1990. Paul Weyrich was there, and Paul Weyrich claimed to him that, we just created the pro-life movement. Like, the pro-life movement is astroturfed. It's all artificially created by us, and we did it to win elections and to get
Is Paul Weyrich still alive? Like, can he refute this? Okay.
Paul Weyrich died about 2 years after Ballmer came out with this conspiracy theory. There's another lady who was an associate of Paul Weyrich. Her name is Connie Marshner, and she's actually writing his biography.
I've met Connie Marshner.
She knew him personally. Like, she really knew him, and she's going to, I guess, correct the record on Paul Weyrich.
Okay.
According to Connie Marshner, he's Catholic. He was very pro-life, and he very, very deeply believed in the pro-life cause. So she disputes what Ballmer said, and she actually knew him. He is going off of a conversation that he had with Paul Weyrich, allegedly back in 1990.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna cast aspersion on Ballmer, but it was one conversation. I know how a lot of these conservative activists are. They like to try to make themselves more important than they really are.
Yes.
And I could very easily see Paul Weyrich kind of
comment
showing off that, hey, I created the pro-life movement. This is my doing. Me and Jerry Falwell, we buddied up and did this.
Yeah. That sounds pretty plausible to me. I mean, so here's the one thing, because I'm hearing all this basically for the first time, especially this whole part. I had no idea. So I'm trying to be as open-minded as I can. And so here's what seems to me to be the best counter argument would be that, okay, yes, there are pro-lifers, including Connie Marshner, who knew this person, who are kind of coming out and they're correcting the records sort of on his behalf. No, he was truly pro-life and all of this. But to be fair, there was also a lot of that in response to the Norma McCorvey documentary.
Yeah.
And I think some of the things that pro-life people were saying about Norma are legitimate and based in real memories, real conversations that they had with her. But at the same time, sometimes seem to not kind of figure out a way to deal with what Norma was saying in multiple conversations and all of this. And so it seems like that would be an interesting thing for someone to say to the Connie Marshners of the world, whom I don't believe would intentionally lie about this. The problem, though, is Norma McCorvey is very documented what she said. You've got to kind of you got to do some mental gymnastics to explain away. It's she's on her deathbed. She maybe was kind of out of her mind or on heavy medication or so. You've got to do a lot of work to figure out why did Norma McCorvey say these kind of awful sounding things in the last year of her life in multiple locations on multiple filming days. Whereas there is no documentation of this one single conversation.
No, there's no video footage of it, nothing like that. He has, so Ballmer has a lot of historical information. It's really I think he does some really valuable work exposing some of the really dark side of racism in the evangelical world in the South. We do have a really kind of nasty history with this.
Yes. Yes.
And Balmer digs into that pretty deep. And so I think like that's some valuable work he's done.
Yeah.
So for example, Jerry Falwell, after Brown v. Board of Education, he actually started one of these segregation schools where it was a Christian school supported by a 501c3 church. They had 501c3 status, and they would not admit African-American students into their school.
Right. Remind me the name of the school. I know the story. What's the name of the school?
I think it's Lynchburg Christian Academy or something along that line.
Okay. I thought didn't he start a college that was also segregated?
Liberty, yeah, he started Liberty University. That's a whole different deal. Lynchburg School, the Christian school, is still in existence. But interestingly, 2 years after he helped start it, they abandoned segregation and decided to admit African-American students 2 years after they started it.
Okay.
So it was a very short-lived kind of experiment. And one of the
real
things,
quick, so before you go on to that, let's just make sure that we keep the record correct. So what is the story with Liberty? Because I think I'm thinking about a completely different college, maybe started by someone else.
Liberty is also in Lynchburg. Okay. It was also started by Jerry Falwell, but it was started later. And I'm not aware of it having, I didn't look too much into Lynchburg, into Liberty, but I'm not really aware of the racial issues there.
So I'm thinking, I know there was a Christian private university that had some pretty racist policies, at least at first. I don't think it's Liberty though. So what I'm just gonna try to figure this out right now. I'll post in the notes or maybe an annotation on the screen. I'll figure that out later.
About that. That was Bob Jones University.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking about. Thank you, sir.
Bob Jones University also had 501c3. See, this all plays into the conspiracy that this is really about segregation.
Yeah.
Bob Jones University was against interracial marriage and interracial dating and prohibited interracial dating on their campus.
Yes.
And the Jimmy Carter administration, I think it may have started with Nixon, I'm not entirely sure, but they actually revoked their 501c3 status because of it. And the Supreme Court upheld the revoking of their 501c3 status. Here again, Bob Jones University has since abandoned racial segregation. They're not doing that anymore, but they continued it quite a while after their 501c3 status was revoked. So like in the evangelical world, like we've got some really nasty stuff that we kind of need to reckon with.
Yeah, and we need to look at it with kind of wide open eyes, and I think not just kind of be like, yeah, that was inadvisable, or that kind of sucks, but like I think to try to really get into the shoes of, an African American student, trying to go to the school, or just the really, really horrible ways that this impacts people's lives. Absolutely, we should take a look at that. But it's kind of easy to point at a couple of really, really, I want to say something like racist men or whatever is going on with these broken human beings. But then to be like, that's the whole pro-life movement is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah. So according to the Balmer's conspiracy, his conspiracy is that Jerry Falwell was really motivated by racial segregation, and that he wasn't particularly interested in overturning Roe v. Wade. He was interested in overturning the Supreme Court decision that took away Bob Jones' tax-exempt status.
Oh, okay.
So in other words, what Jerry Falwell really wanted racially segregated Christian schools to get their tax status back.
Got it.
So that's sort of the Balmer conspiracy. There's a number of problems, like I said, with it. One of the big problems is that people may not understand that the evangelical world is very decentralized. Most leaders in the evangelical world sort of have their little segment that they're influential with. And Jerry Falwell had like his segment.
Yeah. He
did not influence the entire evangelical world. He didn't have the power to just convince us all to suddenly become very pro-life.
Yeah.
Now, there is somebody, and I'll give Connie Marshner credit for this because she points this out. There is somebody who did have that overwhelming influence on evangelicals, and that was Francis Schaeffer.
Yes.
Francis Schaeffer had just this overwhelming influence on the entire evangelical world at that time. And I think he really should get a lot of the credit for the reason that evangelicals have become so pro-life.
Well said. I completely agree with that.
That's sort of that's the direction I come from it with. As far as you'd asked about what would you say to Ilyse Hogue to like probe her with this conspiracy? Because what she did is she took it and she said, this isn't just Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich. There are hundreds of thousands of evangelical voters out there that when they hear pro-life, what they think is racial segregation, and that's what's motivating them to go vote. So she's taken a sort of plausible, little bit kind of crazy conspiracy theory and blown it up into this wild-eyed, bizarre belief that there are all these hundreds of thousands, maybe, I don't know how many, she never says how many, voters all over the country who rushed to the polls to elect Donald Trump because they heard pro-life and translated racial segregation. So that's her. So as far as how do you approach somebody, so here's the thing. There are a lot of like really, really pro-choice feminist types out there that are reading her book, and you might come across them on college campuses.
Yeah.
And so you kind of need to understand where are they getting this from, and how do you, when you're dealing with a conspiracy theory, you can't really deal with it too rationally, because at the center of it is an emotional attachment to this idea that we're 70% of the country. Like there's an emotional attachment there. And so you can't just rationalize it away. That's the problem with conspiracy theories. That's why they spread. So as far as I can tell, sort of the best way to approach it is asking some sort of just really broad questions that force them to kind of confront the problems with their conspiracy without making them look like they're crazy. Like if you start acting like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy, then you have no chance of changing their mind.
Yes. No one has ever changed their mind because someone else called them crazy.
No, never. But one of the problems with her conspiracy theory is she never accounts for Catholics. So how do you explain the fact that before Roe v. Wade, there was a very healthy pro-life movement in the United States, and it was mostly Catholic.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were Democrats because of JFK, and a lot of them were even very liberal. And it's true. Evangelicals sort of came late to the party.
Yeah.
But not only was there this pro-life movement in the Catholic Church before Roe v. Wade, Catholics have continued to dominate the pro-life movement to this day. And so many of the people that Ilyse Hogue cites in her book as like she sees as part of continuing the conspiracy theory are pro-life leaders that are Catholics. And she never bothers to mention they're Catholic. She never confronts that question. You know, how do you explain that like Christian Sherman at Students for Life is Catholic? And I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. Lila Rose is Catholic. How do you explain
Abby
the fact
Johnson
that
now? Yeah.
Like how do you explain this dominance in the pro-life movement? Because they're not like, they weren't listening to Jerry Falwell, presumably.
No.
Like, I can't imagine that. Like, okay, so Marjorie Dannenfelser from, I hope I got her name right, Dannenfelser.
I think
from the
SBA list, Susan B. Anthony list.
Yeah, Susan B. Anthony list. She talks about her a lot in the book because her organization does a lot of the grassroots kind of work needed to win elections.
Yes.
And she's Catholic. And I find it hard to believe, like, you really trying to tell me that Jerry Falwell's influence extends to all these Catholic people.
Right.
I can't even accept that it extends to most evangelicals. And so I would start, like, there's some really big kind of questions that throw this whole thing off. And I would love to know how Ilyse Hogue would answer those.
Yeah. I want to know how many pro-life people she's talked to. Like, I mean, there's this thing where, like, you know, I try to encourage both pro-life and pro-choice people to be charitable, to, you know, it's kind of like assume the best about the other person within reason until they prove to you otherwise. I'm like, we shouldn't go into these conversations with pro-choice people assuming that they like get off on baby murder or something like that. Yeah. And they just, you know, like, you know, they worship at the idol. I mean, that's like a thing. That's like a phrase I've heard pro-lifers say, worship at the altar of premarital sex or whatever. It's like, okay, you know, maybe it's more complicated than that usually. But on the other side too, like maybe, you know, so like, this is so weird to me. So like, and I've mentioned several times kind of recently because there's this recent email exchange I had with a friend of mine, a thoughtful friend of mine who is pro-choice that I'm not going to name because there's a private email exchange, but he legitimately was kind of asking like, are these some of the things that are actually like driving pro-life people? And none of them were this. This is way too far. But still, like there's the more common theory that this is more about punishing people for having sex than it is about babies.
Yeah.
Like we're kind of prudish and we're freaking out that people are having all this bad premarital sex. And then so when they do, we're going to punish them for having that sex with a baby. And we can't punish the guy really. So we punish the woman. Maybe there's like this patriarchal spin that they're adding to it. We want to punish the woman. And so like that's really wrong. That's not what's going on for like hardly anybody. But even that theory is like so much more plausible than Hogue's theory that this is all about like, we want to go back to the 40s.
Well, so Ilyse Hogue, basically her biography is she has been a political career activist her entire life. So she went to college for the environment and studying the environment, became an environmentalist activist as a career, and then switched over to being a pro-choice activist as a career. And so I can kind of see where if you live in a real bubble where you're hearing all the time, because we do hear all the time that Republicans are racist, conservatives are racist. We do hear that all the time.
Yeah.
We do hear that, like, you know, Republican are all white men trying to cling to their power. And so when you're hearing those sorts of things, then this conspiracy, and then Randall Balmer comes along. He got quite a lot of coverage in like progressive sources like Vox and Huffington Post. Like he got a lot of coverage with his theory. And so you see that then it's not hard for me to see somebody really living in a bubble and then having this belief that 70% of the country agrees with me, and then this turning into just this far-flung theory. And she really just spends the rest of her book going through the pro-life movement in sort of like a disparaging way, the way she sees it, and points at these little things and says, see, that's part of the conspiracy. See that right there? That's part of the conspiracy. So she really just does that through the whole book, and then just ends the book by reiterating, you know, what she just told us. So
give one or two of the examples of the things that she points out in the modern pro-life movement that seem to her to be evidence that we want to desegregate the schools.
It's mostly like just political activity. Like, oh, look at Susan B. Anthony list. Their voter guide like looks exactly like Paul Reyrich's voter guide looked. And like, it's the kind of stuff you expect with conspiracy theories. So there's like
so many different possible reasons for that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, totally. Like voter guides are commonplace now, right? Progressive groups use voter guides. Are you going to say that they're following in Paul Reyrich's conspiracy?
Right.
But I
like
mean,
if Planned Parenthood's voter guide and NARAL's voter guide is basically the same state to state, like that's not going to be like, ooh, there's a link. I'm going to be like, well, of course. Like that's exactly what I would expect. It would be weird if they were very different.
I did not see, like, you would expect to see, like, here's a racist quote from Susan B. Anthony list, or there was none of that. I didn't see any racist quotes. It was all about political organizing and how the pro-life movement has just harnessed this power of all these voters to go get Republicans elected, and how it all was part of Paul Reyrich's plan. Like he foresaw this, you know, plan to get Republicans elected. So what can I say? It's a conspiracy theory. It's not going to, there's not a whole lot of rational.
Yeah, but the fact that it's taking off, like NARAL should be embarrassed.
I know.
I'm surprised. I'm really surprised that this is like, that so many people are jumping on. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be. Maybe I shouldn't be because it's 2020 and all the Trump stuff, and like maybe it shouldn't be a surprise to me at this point, like that people are jumping onto this. But it's
I'll give you more. So here's some more evidence from the conference that they're really emotionally invested in this belief that they're in the majority.
Okay,
they have a whole segment on courageous conversations. And you would think this is the same kind of thing that like ERI does. Like, how do we have conversations with people and persuade them, to be more pro-life and to move more in our direction, finding common ground, et cetera.
Right.
For their courageous conversations, The goal is to help your friends and family realize that they're actually pro-choice. I am not kidding. That was.
Oh, that's so.
So they would throw out some lines like,
and manipulative.
Try saying this to your family member, and then when they agree with you, you can explain to them that that's really pro-choice. And if we could just help these people realize that they're actually part of our side, they're part of the 70%. Which here again, if you have to convince them to realize they're pro-choice, are you really in the 70%? Like,
I mean, maybe they just didn't know they were.
Explain to me, like, the stuff just doesn't add up, you know?
I mean, I don't want to get to definition. What is the 70%? If she's the one who is combining a whole bunch of kind of different answers on a Gallup poll or whatever and saying, look, here is us, and this is basically all the same thing and not several different pies that add up to 70%.
I think if you, depending on how you segment certain polls, what you'll find is what percentage of you think that abortion should at least be legal in the cases of rape, incest, and the life of the mother?
It's definitely the majority.
You're probably going to get 70% with that. I can see 20%, maybe 25% saying, no, it should not be legal ever in any case. That's how you get to 70%, but she doesn't have any nuance in her book. Like, there's no realization that, hey, saying it should be legal in the case of rape is not saying you should be able to have an elective abortion, like, at viability.
Yeah.
That's not the same thing.
I mean, and to be fair, pro-life people do this kind of thing too with the polls. I mean, so you know, if you look at polls where it's like, okay, I mean, generally speaking, I think the opinion polls basically kind of end up saying a majority of people are fine with more restrictions on abortion than we currently have, and a majority of people think that first trimester abortion ought to be legal, generally speaking. Like, those are both true things about them. Like, right now, the majority, which means we've got more culture work to do.
Right.
But both pro-life and pro-choice people will take what I just said and spin that their own way. Pro-choice people can say, look, most Americans agree that abortion should generally be legal, and 90% of the abortions are first trimester. And so basically, a majority of Americans are functionally pro-choice. And there's something to that. But then pro-life people take literally the exact same thing and be like, look, most of the country is pro more restrictions on abortion, so they're basically pro-life. And what I want to say is, it's more complicated than both of those statements. It's overly simplistic.
Yeah. So there was an interesting study done by I'm trying to remember the name, the evangelical pollster.
Barna?
Yeah, Barna Group. Yeah, he did a study where he found that something like 20 to 30% of pro-life people thought that abortion should be legal, like, in a lot of cases in the first trimester. And a lot of, like, it's about the same number, about 20 to 30% who called themselves pro-choice said that it should always be illegal. So, like, these pro-life, pro-choice labels are almost functionally meaningless.
Yeah.
But Ilyse Hogue doesn't mince, she doesn't do any nuance to anything. It's you're either pro-choice or you're pro-life. And if you think abortion should ever be legal for any reason, then you're on my side.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so let's think about that tactic for a minute. Okay, so this idea of we're going to use very careful word choices to try to lead people through this little workflow. It's probably not even that many steps. Get them to say something that fits within the pro-choice bucket or whatever, and then be like, see, you're on my side. Because so, like, to me, that is super off-putting. Yeah. But I am unusually kind of maybe to the, maybe not extreme, but like we really try to teach people, like, try to not lead people certain places in the conversation, or else it's off-putting. They don't typically like that, and they can tell what you're doing and they kind of shut down. And so it seems like, well, if that wouldn't work for pro-lifers, which is still kind of currently my view, although it certainly works for some people, like some things will work for some segment of the population. It seems like, would that be the case with pro-choice people? Would it potentially work better with pro-choice people than talking to sort of pro-choice, sort of pro-life people, whatever that means, versus pro-life people using with pro-choice people? Or is it just going to be off-putting to everyone?
I think it's going to be off-putting to everyone, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, seems like it. It feels like a trick. It feels like they tricked.
Yeah.
It's like a
trick where Ilyse Hogue is tricking herself. Like she has to believe she's in the majority. So she's like talked herself into this.
Yeah. And that part is like really strange to me, Jordan, because if her whole part of the book is talking about this like secret racism within the pro-life movement, if you go back 100 years, you've got a majority of America was racist, or 150 years, whatever it is. I don't know exactly, and I don't know what the polls were, but you go back far enough, a majority of the public were functionally racist, and or more like very actively, horribly, painfully racist. And so like Hogue would agree, like, hey, that doesn't make the racist right. It just means this is a horrible historical fact that I just said. And luckily, we're on the right track. Slowly but surely, our culture is becoming less and less racist. Like, why does he think that right now being in the majority is like so like integral to her view?
I don't know, but I see it a lot in progressive movements in general, like on other issues like the environment or whatever it is. There's definitely a movement among progressives to have a more democratic government. We want to vote more on stuff. Mm-hmm. We want to have referendums on stuff. Like this is really a big deal. And I don't want to speculate too much why it's such a big deal, because I'm not a progressive and I am like an evangelical Christian. I believe in the Bible. Like I have a sense of morality outside myself and outside the world that I'm kind of stuck on.
Right.
But if you don't have that, like you got to get like your sense of rightness from somewhere. I could see why somebody would be like, hey, we've got the votes, we can do it, therefore it's right. That's the best I can come up with. But there is very much a move for more democratic government among the progressive side. And it's something that like appeals to me personally. Like I wish we had a little bit of referendum here in Delaware. We have no referendums on anything pretty much in Delaware. And I would love for really extreme laws for us to have like the people's veto, like let us vote on it. So, but Ilyse Hogue, one of the reasons I say she really believes this stuff is because she's not a big defender of Roe v. Wade. Like Roe v. Wade brought abortion without democracy. It just was foisted upon us. Yeah. And so in her conference, there was maybe once or twice they barely mentioned Roe v. Wade. But whenever they're talking about courts and judges, it's always in the context of overturning Brown v. versus Board of Education. It's never about Roe. It's always about that. And so I'm like, okay, you seem to believe this enough that you've almost abandoned Roe v. Wade. It's barely mentioned in her book.
Yeah.
Which is just really kind of bizarre. But in my mind, I'm thinking if you really believe in democracy so much, then maybe you should just go ahead and side with us. Let's overturn Roe v. Wade and let's just see where it goes. If that's what you really believe. See, that's another question I would like to ask Ilyse Hogue. If democracy is really so important, and if you have 70%, let's all agree to overturn Roe and let's see how it plays out and see if your theory is right.
Yeah. Okay. I have an observation and a little bit of a conspiracy theory of my own.
Okay.
Which is very unlike me, but let's just like at least play with the idea as a thought experiment. But my observation is, to Hogue's defense, she probably couldn't have picked a better time to publish this book. With critical race theory kind of really starting to take over in the culture, this is a moment that is being capitalized on here and is probably more persuasive to the average pro-choice person than it would have been 5 years ago, or at least 10 years ago. So that's interesting. Here's a little bit of a conspiracy theory. This is the very not charitable theory where Hogue, or at least maybe the people that are behind Hogue or funding Hogue, don't really buy this. What if like pro-choice people, pro-choice leaders feel like they're kind of slowly losing this cultural battle? It's back and forth. It's not like I feel like either side is like hugely victorious. Like, it's like, the abortion rate has been going down for a long time, which is really, really good. And there's multiple reasons for that. And it's not all pro-life laws. Public opinion kind of goes back and forth a bit, but has stayed in the big scheme of things, relatively constant on this. But young people are less often pro-choice based on the opinion polls. And so they feel like they're slowly losing a culture battle. And then you've got like they're really upset because of Kavanaugh is on the court and Gorsuch is on the court. And of course, right now, with everything going on with Ruth Bader Ginsburg recently having died, at least when we're recording this, I don't know when this is going out, but this is like, we're a week or two out right now, today from with Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. And so that whole debate is going on right now about what the Republicans are going to do. And are they going to try to get someone on before the election or after the election? What if they feel like, okay, it is hard for us to get our side to be very passionate about abortion because, look, it's just easier to talk about defending life than defending abortion choice. Like, I don't care who you are. It's an easier pitch for the pro-life person to the big group of college students. And they say, but one of the worst things you can call someone is a racist. And right now, our country is rightfully taking a closer look at racism or functional racism that happens in different institutions and things like that. And what if we were able to get people more passionately on our side voting with us? Whether or not they care a lot about abortion themselves, but at least they're voting with us more because they don't feel like they're fighting this lovely, Catholic mom pro-life movement, thing, but they're fighting the racists. They are fighting the people who secretly want to take away Brown versus Board of Education and desegregate the schools. Like you think they're nice, okay? But they're really not. They're horrible. This is what's actually going on. You better vote with us because you don't know what's behind door number 2 over there that's got the big R on it. Like, is it possible that's
I think
part of what's going on?
I think partially is probably true and partially not.
Okay.
So in terms of selling the book and getting influence and spreading the message, the book seems to be an abysmal failure.
Really?
I don't see the pro-choice movement outside of NARAL. I don't see anybody really getting on board with this. I don't see other pro-choice organizations promoting her book or reviewing her book or anything like that. It's almost going unnoticed by the rest of the pro-choice movement. Some of that might just be territorial ambitions. Maybe they've got as many divisions as we do, and they just don't want a competing pro-choice organization to get credit. But it's just not outside of NARAL and NARAL's people. It's just not taking off. So, for example, it was published by a very, very small progressive publisher. It was practically self-published.
Okay.
And I self-published my book, so I know what to look for. I know all about this. And last I checked, I had 3 reviews on Amazon, and I think she only had 2. So it's not like she has this vast influence,
right?
Despite the fact that she is, she's very high up in the Democrat Party. She got really big names to blurb her book. She got Stacey Abrams to blurb her book, some big names in the Democrat Party. I had Destiny from New Wave Feminists blurb my book, but I still have more reviews on Amazon than she does, at least last I checked.
Weird. It seems like the kind of book that will maybe do well in women's studies classes or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. So the part where I think you're onto something is with trying to build a broader pro-choice coalition by bringing in racial minorities. So in the conference, there was a lot of talk about that we have a problem. Our problem is we're almost entirely college-educated white women in the pro-choice movement. And we need to build a broader coalition. And one of the ways we can do this, they explicitly explain this as a strategy in their conference. One of the ways we do this is by getting involved in Black Lives Matter and any kind of racial justice issue and getting in there and convincing them that reproductive justice is also important along with racial justice and get them into our movement. It's classic intersectional strategy.
Yeah.
They had one state director from one state who had some minimal success trying to get some Hispanic women involved with NARAL, and they sort of talked about that. But they didn't really have like this great grand strategy like, bingo, we're Paul Ryrick on the pro-choice side, and we're going to bring all these Hispanics in, and we're going to take over America. Like, that wasn't there. I think you're partially right about the whole racial issue. Like, they need to broaden their coalition somehow.
Yeah.
And they see this as a way to do that. And so
and they're grabbing onto the movement, to be fair, that is like maybe the most successful activism movement that we've seen in 30, 40 years?
Long
probably?
time. My whole life. I'm 34. I've never seen anything like it. Like, we have, where I'm at in Sussex County, we're very conservative, very rural. Mm-hmm. I've never really seen I've never seen a progressive grassroots of any kind in my area. But when Black Lives Matter came along, we had a local Black Lives Matter march in a nearby town. Like, I've never seen that for a progressive issue before. Yeah. So they are trying to latch on to something that's been pretty successful.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that she doesn't believe her own conspiracy. It's just, it's awfully convenient part of her political strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm basically going to give up trying to figure out what is going on in Hogue's head, especially having not personally read the book, but it just feels like all of the stars are aligning for her. What's the word I'm looking for?
Like fate. Like how did you have this fate that it just kind of, your theory just happened to align with Black Lives Matter?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if there had been if let's say that environmentalism and like climate change is a really big deal right now.
Yeah.
Would she have gone out and found that, hey, evangelicals secretly want to destroy the planet? Like, I don't know. Maybe she would have. I'm not in her head.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just this thing was developing. Like Ballmer's theory came out around 2012. Like, it was before this. Yeah. So, and it was pretty widely circulated, like in progressive circles. So maybe this has already been ruminating in her mind. Yeah. And then the moment came and she decided to spring on it.
Let's wrap up on kind of practical tips. And you did this a little bit earlier, but let's just talk about like, okay, pro-life people, you're going to be hearing this one probably, if nothing else, on campus with gender studies students or something like I predict this is going to do really well in those classes. Like the professors are going to be buying this book in bulk and utilizing it. Yeah. Especially as, again, critical race theory is kind of taking off and all of that. And so let's try to think of some tips for dealing with this. Like, there's a couple that come to my mind, and I want to hear any that come to your mind, Jordan. But like, one thing would be to, you need to be willing to kind of confront and distance yourself from any legitimate, true examples of racism in the pro-life movement. Whether or not you're talking about, I don't know if Jerry Falwell counts as pro-life movement. I never have thought of him as a pro-life leader. I would hope he wouldn't be. I wouldn't want him leading the pro-life movement. But like, if someone gives you like, yeah, but what about Bob Jones University? Like, if you know the facts are like, they're right. Like, don't just like take everything they say hook, line, and sinker. Like, do your own research. But if you know, and I've done research on Bob Jones University, I know enough about Bob Jones that a lot of the things that have been accused of Bob Jones University are true. Maybe not every single thing, but there's a lot of really ugly things that are very true and have been very, very well substantiated about that university. And so just be willing to say, yeah, you're right. Isn't that awful? Can you believe there was this Christian university where we're supposed to believe that all human beings are made in God's image? Like, that's where the Christians are supposed to be coming from. So, even if you're an atheist, like, know that's what we're supposed to believe. So you can know if you're talking to a Christian who's like, on track or off track. And yet they had this segregation type policy or these other kind of racism policies. That's really bad. I'm completely opposed to that. Like, I'm with you on that. So be willing to, like, don't defend every single person who's ever been opposed to abortion, regardless of what they do. And if there is a modern pro-life leader who says some things that are racist and you think they're racist, like, be willing to just be like, hey, we're in agreement on that one. That's not what's driving me, and it's not what's driving, I think, the vast majority of the pro-life movement. But are there a couple of racists in the pro-life movement? Sure. Yes. just like there's a fringe element of kind of any group that's embarrassing to the rest of us. Like, yes, the pro-life movement has that. The pro-choice movement has that. And every like Black Lives Matter movement, I bet, has that too. And so like, that's a thing. So just be willing to distance yourself from legitimate rape. Like, and just be like, look, and not just distance yourself. Like, I want to say like, condemn it. Be like, it's really, really, really wrong. I'm with you, and find that common ground. But also kind of, you can make clear, like in the end, if they're like, hey, well, I think I've got this, 50 examples. And if you don't know what to do with it on the spot, you can say like, look, I don't know what's going on with all of that. If you give me the list, I'd be happy to look into it. Give me your email address. And if you give me that, I'm willing to get back to you and look into all of that. But right now, I don't know but would you be willing to talk to me? All I know is what's driving me as a pro-life person, and racism has nothing to do with it. And so if I'm wrong about abortion, I want you to help me figure that out. But just saying that there's some other pro-life people that are racist, and I don't even know if that's true or not, like that's not changing my mind about abortion today. But you might be able to change my mind about abortion today if you show me that the unborn is not a person, or that bodily autonomy should trump everything, or whatever. Like like can you talk to me now, not these like ghosts of theoretically racist pro-life leaders that you see behind me or something like that.
Or even some nasty things that like recently pro-life people have said, like not mainline leaders, but like I've seen some pretty nasty things pro-lifers have said.
Yes.
Like not 1970s. I'm talking like in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
So I agree with that 100%. Like I'll be the first to admit that like some of the things Donald Trump has said about immigrants, for example, really upsets me a lot.
Me too.
And I'm saying that as like a generally conservative leaning kind of evangelical Christian. Like I'm not a fan of what Donald Trump says about a lot of things related to immigration.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. We need to be willing to admit that we have had some nasty history in the evangelical world. I think beyond that, like when you're dealing with people who believe in conspiratorial kind of things that just are not like, I'm living in the pro-life world. I'm living in a pro-life bubble. That's not the way it is. Yeah. You can kind of bring up information that they've never heard about before that makes them think. Yeah. And I've had a lot of success with talking to pro-choice people in general. For example, you could say, we have about 3,000 pregnancy care centers across the country that are providing help to pregnant women so that they won't get abortions. And most of them are run by evangelicals. Yeah. Some are run by Catholics, but largely it's sort of an evangelical thing to do this.
Yes.
And if Ilyse Hogue is correct that, pro-lifers don't actually really care whether women have abortions or not, why would we invest so much time and energy into 3,000 centers around the country? Why would we do that?
Yeah.
Like there's some really obvious questions to conspiracy theories that like, I don't expect them to just abandon a conspiracy theory because they're very invested in this. Yeah. But it makes them think like, hey, maybe we've got some problems with our theory.
Yeah. I like that you brought up, like, again, I think it's fair to call this a conspiracy theory. And so like one other thought kind of comparing to other conspiracy theories in my mind would be asking the question, I've asked this before, but it's like every conversation, but especially I think if I'm dealing with a conspiracy theory, one, I think maybe good question would be, tell me about what kind of evidence you could come across in theory, hypothetically speaking, that would change your mind about that theory. What kind of evidence would it take? So like if you're talking to a 9/11 truther who, he's watched, what is it called? What's the movie called?
Fahrenheit 9/11 or something like that.
No, it's not that one. It's the one that like real conspiracy theories made. I forget what it's called off the top of it. I'm going to be like walk out of the studio and it's going to come to my mind. Anyway, that movie there's like a bunch of different cuts of it and different versions of it. And 9/11 truthers have bought into it, and I knew one, which is why I watched it just to kind of better understand. So it's like, it's like the thing with conspiracy theories is like, they've always got an answer for everything. And so, it's like, what kind of evidence would actually change your mind? As opposed to just being like, well, what do you do with this evidence and this evidence and this evidence? Like, maybe don't even start with trying to counter like the whole theory. Maybe start with like, I want to hear from you. Like I'm sure you want to be open-minded, just like I'm trying to be open-minded. what kind of evidence would change your mind? I'm happy to answer that question too. Here's what kind of evidence would change my mind about abortion or whatever, or your theory even. What kind of evidence would persuade you that maybe this theory is not true? Just get them thinking. And that's not a leading question. That is a clarification question. That is detective mode. You're just asking them like, hey, I'm legitimately curious about this. Like, I'm interested in what your answer is.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good option. I'm not sure what somebody who believes in a conspiracy theory would say to that.
Me neither, but I want them thinking about it.
I'd love to know. Like, you're right. I would love to know. I think it's important when we talk to somebody who's believing in a conspiracy theory that we have a little bit of humility about what they might be going through, because conspiracy theories are very common. We've all probably believed in them at times. And just because I'm looking at this going, wow, Ilyse Hogue sounds like really crazy, like really lost her mind or something.
Yeah.
The fact is, I've probably believed in a conspiracy theory at some point in my life where everyone else is looking at me thinking I'm crazy.
Yeah.
Because the reality is, like, you look at a lot of those things that might lead somebody to believing something. Like, for example, your party is no longer in power and you're very partisan. Yeah. Well, every 4 or 8 years, the White House changes hands. And when the White House changes hands, guess what? I need some way to explain how they got there and why they won.
Right.
So especially if you're very much involved in politics or any kind of ideological issues, there's probably conspiracy theories swirling all around you, and you may believe in some right now, and maybe you should confront yourself about some of the ones maybe you believe right now.
I love that.
So
yes,
have some humility going into this.
Yeah.
I think would go a long way. Don't just think this person's off their rocker.
Yeah. Like,
they have a reason for believing this. Like, something's motivating them. It could be very emotional. It could be so I mean, maybe I might talk to, if somebody comes to me like straight out of this book, like she's read this book, she knows the conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
I might say, you know what? What if America suddenly became 50-50? Half the country wanted abortion to be mostly illegal, half the country mostly not. Like, just hypothetically, stay with me here. In my opinion, that doesn't mean you're wrong. Like, even if you're in the minority, even if 70% of the country wants to make abortion illegal, in my mind, that doesn't mean you're wrong in your position. That just means 70% of the country isn't with you. And maybe strike right at the heart of what's motivating Ilyse Hogue here. Like, hey, this is something you can let go of and still be right in your position.
Yeah, I really like that. And kind of going back to your humility point, maybe another thing worth remembering, and something that, like, I may have failed out this afternoon. Like, this one, I'm sorry, it just feels so bonkers as a guy in the pro-life movement. But remembering how, I mean, first of all, a lot of people aren't primarily logical in the way that they process the world around them, right? But also how powerful it is when you kind of get started thinking something's true, and then you find like just 3 or 4 pieces of evidence that seem to back that up, how powerful that can be. And a lot of people might not be trying very hard to figure out how to debunk that, but how often are people trying to debunk their own views, right? I mean, this is that confirmation bias thing. This is why, if you haven't heard the Tangle interview I did, you should listen to that interview, because that guy's trying to help people get outside of confirmation bias. There's not a lot of people that are doing that as effectively as I think Isaac Saul is. But like, you know, I remember like there's a video that came out in the last, I think, year, is like this, you know, the Air Force has finally released, you know, this footage. I think it's like 3 different videos that purport to show UFOs, right? And it looks really impressive. And you're listening to like fighter jet, I don't know if you've seen this, but you're listening to like fighter jet pilots that are like, I can't believe what I'm seeing. Like, I've seen all kinds of stuff, but this is crazy. And like, I was like, that's really interesting. I've only seen one thing online that explains what that video is showing. And then I don't remember it well enough to really do it here. I might go find it and link to it in the comments. But it had to do with like, if you understand the way these plane cameras operate and the way that they move, like they're doing certain things, that are very, very unusual. You don't see cameras acting like that. That actually explains the erratic movement that you're seeing. Here's what's actually going on. And as I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, that makes total sense. But I would have never come up with that on my own because like I didn't understand the technology well enough, right? So just like a lot of people want to believe what they want to believe. And we all want to believe that the other side is evil. They're not just ignorant, they are evil. And it
never hurts to question your own motivation. Why am I so wanting to defend this?
Yeah.
Why? Like, question your own motivation sometimes.
Does it make you feel good? Why does it make you feel good? You know?
Yeah. And on the pro-life side, most pro-lifers tend to be very conservative, tend to vote Republican, and we've got our own conspiracies on, quote, our side that maybe we should deal with. So the big one right now is this QAnon. You may have heard of this QAnon.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I have friends who are very pro-life conservative, and there's just no talking them out of this conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
And it doesn't help, like, we kind of are getting a double dose of it because not only do we have Democrats who are not in power, so they have reasons to create things like, Russia, conspiracy, and whatever conspiracies they want to come up with. We also have a president who really seems to like these conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Donald Trump said something to the effect of, well, I've heard these supporters of QAnon like me. And so that's a great thing because he likes anybody who likes him.
Right.
And it's like, so we're getting a double dose because we have a president in office who throws out things like, one of my favorites is, my favorite in that it's insane, is that Ted Cruz's father was somehow involved in the killing of JFK.
Yeah. Like
Donald Trump said that on the campaign trail and people
in the primary debates
believed
or whatever,
it. So we're getting like this double dose of conspiracy theories right now. And so we can just throw Ilyse Hogue right in there with the mix. We sometimes do the same thing. I think it's a really fair point. And first of all, don't send me angry emails. No one here is saying who you should vote for or who you shouldn't vote for. Jordan is just quoting literally a couple of these are just facts. Okay. They're just facts. I'll link to the sources if you don't believe it. I'll also post a couple of links about the QAnon conspiracy theory in the description if you want to learn more. But if you've never heard of that, it's worth knowing about. There are enough Christians, enough pro-lifers that have bought into this. It's very, very much a conspiracy theory. But good for people to be kind of aware of what this thing is because you're going to hear about it sometimes. So I'll find a couple of links about that. But man, this has been interesting. So I really appreciate you reading the book and presenting kind of the strongest version of this. And I just appreciate kind of your way of having this conversation where, we don't just want to beat up on Ilyse Hogue, but it's kind of like, here's like multiple things that seem to be going on. And here's some parts of that kind of are plausible. Like I just really appreciate that. So you recently wrote a pro-life book. I'm going to link to it in the description. Yeah. Real quick, give a plug for what that book is about and why pro-life people ought to read it. The book is called Fetal Beauty. You can find it at fetalbeauty.com. And that'll take you to the Amazon profile. And the first part of the book talks a little bit about my personal experience because I want people to see that I have experience with foster care, adoption, and fertility treatments. So I bring a unique perspective to this. The second part of the book is all about fetal development. I try to take really complicated concepts in the textbooks used by medical students and try to break it down into concepts that just everyday people like me can understand. And then the third part goes into the abortion procedures. And I rely very heavily on 2 medical textbooks that are actually used to teach people how to do abortions. And here again, breaking it down into concepts we can understand using their verbiage from their books to kind of show that to everybody. So you can go check that out, fetalbeauty.com.
Awesome. Jordan Warfel, thanks so much for coming on today. This has been super interesting and I think a conversation that people are going to enjoy.
Thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I very much respect what you all are doing at the Equal Rights Institute and the podcast. When I'm sitting at work needing stuff to listen to, this is always one I jump to. So
thank you very much. I appreciate it. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Equipped for Life podcast, a project of Equal Rights Institute. Equal Rights Institute uses speaking, writing, YouTube videos, podcasts, online courses, and campus outreach to help pro-life advocates in the areas of practical dialogue tips, relational apologetics, pro-life philosophy, and sidewalk counseling. If you've been helped by this podcast, please consider supporting it by making a donation at equalrightsinstitute.com.